Yeah, welcome and good morning to the next Symfony workshop. This one is about forms. And I hope you are all alright or slightly hangover, I don't know. As a start, we are going to talk about forms for the next 3 hours. And I'm Christopher, your trainer for the next hours, and I'm working at Sensor Labs as a trainer, so I do that for a living, so to say. I'm a Symfony developer for about 8 years now, and I live in Berlin. I'm organizing a user group over there, so if you come to Berlin, maybe you have the opportunity to join one meetup event. With me today is Christian over here. He's helping me out if someone has questions in the middle, because we're doing quite a lot of exercises and challenges. You might better know him that way. Maybe saw him on GitHub. So this time in live support, so to say. So the agenda. We're talking about the form component. So I'll try to limit it on that component. Of course, we will do some validation in the classical way at the beginning, and afterwards we will see how to add errors by ourselves. We will kick off with a basic example, so we have a common ground about controllers and form types. And then we will focus on what is going on inside the form component. So you know controllers and you know form types, but what is actually going on when handling a request. And after that we will focus on extension points of this request handling. All right. Do you have used the component before, the form component? Yes? Awesome. Okay. Yeah, you have been here the last day, so I think that's quite clear to you. You're using the virtual machine, right? Yes? So the repository is already checked out for you. And to get started, you can just start the virtual machine, change the directory to Symfony Forms, and then you need to do a git pull once again, and a composer install, and we're using the Symfony CLI as a web server, so we don't have to deal with the Apache. So we're diving into it directly, but there will be slides about theory as well. I will switch between slide deck and IDE while doing the workshop, because I'm doing the exercises for myself and repeating, so you can see what my solution will be. And after that you can open up the website just using localhost port 8000 in the virtual machine. And I think that should look like this, right? And besides that, you can always check using bin console -- version if the application on CLI is running as well. So everything fine? Maybe you can give me a short... Yes, awesome. Thanks. All right, we're doing coding challenges. They always have a defined goal. And that goal is defined by merging a branch into your local environment. So you could, if you want to work test-driven. I implemented functional tests that you should make green while implementing the form types or controllers. But of course you can use the browser and just have a look at the feature yourself without using PHP Unit. But if you get confused or lost, there's always a rescue branch that is pushed afterwards when I finish the challenge as well. There is in the repository as well, there is a binary called bin/check that executes a couple of static code analysis tools or PHP unit. You can just run it now and you will see there are some Symfony checks in it, like linting of YAML files and twig files. So if you have an error while developing, you can always run that tool and you will get some help, like, oh, look at your service YAML, it's not valid YAML or something. But usually you just have to write PHP today and a bit of twig. There's also a composer and schema validation, code style and static code analysis, and of course the PHP unit test suite. And as I said, there will be functional tests. You don't have to write them, but you will merge them into your local development environment. Questions about that? Great. All right. The form component itself. It is indeed the largest component of Symfony. So around 56,000 lines of code, including blank lines and comments. So it's quite large. And it's completely rewritten for Symfony 2. And it's about 9 years old now. And despite there were a lot of changes during Symfony 3 and 4, the base mechanic of the component is still the same. And we're trying to focus on that today. I know a few years ago Bernhard Schussig was here, who originally wrote the thing, and he said the credo of the component is to make simple things simple and complex things possible. Well, the second part of the sentence is a bit of a downer because you already know that the complex part might be complex, right? But we try to tackle that one today, and we're going to start off. What is the purpose of the component? So, you know, that's a simple form, but it's more that like a HTML representation of a form, right? So we have HTML input types for sender and subject, and a text area for the message, and we have a submit button. So that is the one thing. We want to achieve that on the front end side. And on the back end side, we want to achieve that we have a object-oriented representation of that form. So we always can couple a PHP object to an HTML form. So that's the basic challenge of this component. Well, that's not really PHP, but it's pseudo code at that point. But I guess you get the point. Right. So the form component is all about the connection between this PHP object and our HTML view. And to tackle that, the form component looks like this. That is a simplified version of the parts of the architecture. And yeah, the foundation itself is the form component, which relies on different components like property access, options resolver, or event dispatcher. So they are already installed when you use the form component. And for you right now on the virtual machine, it is already installed. So we already have everything we need. And the form component defines a lot of extension points and uses them themselves. For example, the core extension. The core extension provides us things like the text type. And the validation is an extension that combines the validator component and the form component, so we can use validation on DTO objects. I think you saw that before, right? So you have a annotation like assert not blank on your model. And on top, we have a layer that takes care about the view. I think the left part is the important one because we are just using Twig. And there are a couple of helper functions. I think you know them. All right. So the basic glue code. Our first challenge will be to write a contact form, a very simple one, and we have to implement a couple of things for that. We have to implement a very basic controller. This is a very basic example how a controller action looks like in a typical way for handling a form. And it's about having the GET request and the POST request in one action, and having a conditional about the state of the form in the middle for form processing. So we have a form type that maps the data object called DTO down here to form fields, right? You know that. And we have a template where we, for example, can split up the view. We could use form, but in this example, I'm using form start and form rest and form end, for example, to render the button myself, which is part of the best practice. If you have questions about that, you can always look up the best practice documentation. I think there is a link in the markdown file in your repository. Oh, I didn't tell you, there is a markdown file in your repository with the challenges in it. So there's challenges MD, and I won't go into detail about best practices or the basic stuff, but if we have questions about that while implementing it, we can tackle them. All right. So the controller handles a request, creates a form, triggers processing, and creates a response. That's the responsibility of a controller. Right? The form type defines the structure and configures some option and something else. That's a cliffhanger. And the template renders the form. And we can add additional markup, of course. So the first challenge is to build a very simple contact form. And therefore, you can just merge contact/01-base into your branch. Maybe you create a new branch like solution or something where you can continuously work today. So there was, I guess, a new service, some changes to the service.yaml, and a new test file. So if you run bin PHP unit now, it is red. And to fix that, you have to implement a DTO, a data transfer object, which is expected to be in the namespace app contact DTO. And for doing that, you can look at the app contact mailer, which is a service that is already in the project now. And you can like reverse engineer the DTO by using that. So have a look at the app contact mailer, and you will see the properties which are needed to implement the DTO. If you have the DTO, you can easily implement the contact type. If you have questions about that, just raise your hand, and Christian and I will help you out. And afterwards, you can implement the controller action and the template. There are some additional infos and additional challenges in the markdown file challenges MD. So if you are already done quite fast with the challenge, you can look in the challenges markdown file and you find additional branches to merge and to tackle additional tasks, challenges. If you have a look at the markdown file, you will see there are some documentation links inside. So I now do the same, but quite slowly, so we can talk about every step. So the first step is to implement the DTO. Do you already have the fields for it? Which are they? Name, email, subject, and message, right? And in this case, we have public properties. In the form component for a model, you can always use public properties or private or protected properties with getter and setter. And I guess isser as well. In this case, we don't really have logic to implement in setters and getters, so we just don't have them. So that's quite easy, right? So that's the data object that is bind to our form later on. The second step is to implement a form type, for this contact form, and I call it just contact type. And every time we're implementing a form type in our application, we're extending the abstract type of the form component. And that's something you might remember for later on. Even if we want to implement inheritance of types, we implement the abstract type. But I will say that at least one time again. So we can override some messages in here, and the classic one is build form. And if I don't specify the type, which is used as a child type in here, it's usually the text type. And if I want to switch to another type, I can easily specify it in the second argument of the add method. And in this case, I use the email type. And in the case of the message, I use the text area type. Looks quite the same. Yeah. What is missing? The submit is missing, right? But I'm not going to add it. I'm going to add the submit button in the template later on. Because according to the best practice, which is a document in the Symfony documentation, the submit button is an impediment if you want to reuse the type on a different place. If you imagine you have a customer type and you want to reuse that customer type in maybe a back office for your customer service and in a registration form in your checkout, you might not want the same button in there, and maybe end up having multiple buttons. So, but something else is missing. Pardon? The data class, right? We need to tell the form type using an option which data class this form is coupled to. Therefore, we override the method configure options and use the set default on the resolver to specify the default data class. So if no data is given to the form component will instantiate a new instance of the DTO for us. We could have forms without data classes, but then the data is just pure an array. Next thing is the controller, of course. By the way, if you're done, you can always send a pull request to the GitHub repository if you want to. But I can only review them later, so it's not possible right now. But maybe when we tackle more complex tasks, you might end up with a different solution than I, and it might be interesting to discuss them. So this is how the parameter profile of my controller action looks like. So I'm requiring the service mailer and the request object, because for the form handling later, if the form is valid, we need to send a mail. If you have questions, if you spot differences in the style I write controller actions or controllers or annotations, and have questions about it, just let me know. Maybe we can. Yes? I really, usually I start with services. And then I have the request object and routing parameters last. I don't know if there is an official recommendation for that, but that's
only one recommendation to put the request first, because it's always mandatory, but it's only about parameters, I think.
okay.
Services are mandatory here too. So
In this case,
I would just be consistent across projects.
yeah, the most important thing is to be consistent. So, but it does not really matter. One maybe important thing, if you're dealing with Scala type declarations, you could, you can only use string for routing parameters. Symfony won't cast them if you have, if you don't use this declare strict types and have an integer as a type declaration for a maybe page parameter or something, then PHP might do it without a warning. But if you have declare strict types 1 like me, that might raise an error. All right. So the first thing we're doing in a controller is we're creating a form using the create form method, which is provided by the abstract controller. And second part, we're binding the request object to the form. Those two lines are very, very important, and we will tackle later on what exactly is going on there. But I think you've seen them before, and maybe you've stepped into it while debugging. But usually we don't really care what's going on inside. Then there is the very characteristic is submitted and form is valid. Conditional, which just uses the state of the form object right now. And it's important that every time you do form processing, so you have a writing operation on server side, that you do a redirect afterwards. Because you don't want the user to trigger the same processing by hitting Control R, for example, or F5, or reopening the browser tab. That's nothing Symfony specific, but I guess a best practice just in how to handle HTTP requests. And to have some user feedback, I will also add a flash message. I think you are familiar with flash messages. They are a concept quite around in frameworks. So session specific. Oh yeah, thanks. And another one. And the last thing we need to do is to create a view from the form object. While adding the template, we should just extend the base HTML so we can reuse the markup which is already there. I define a block title, contact us, and a block content. So if we are doing prototyping or don't have any constraints about the markup which is rendered, we can always use form, which will render the template, render the form completely. But in my case, I didn't write any button in the form type. and I need to do it myself. But usually there are some requirements for the markup, so it is quite common to use those form methods. And I use form widget, for example, to render the form, and then I can add a button type submit. And add some front-end specific classes. What is your experience in projects? Do you use form or do you break it up in multiple methods? Break it up? Yeah. Usually. Yeah. Hopefully you don't end up using the form vars variable, but sometimes that's the case as well. But the view object of the form we just created by form create view is more than a stateful object without any logic in it, and we can always access multiple variables of it. But if you have a look at the object, you might get confused because it's quite large. So, did I miss something, or should this work? Doesn't work on my machine, but I have still a to-do on line 25 in controller. Missed that one. So of course, I can access the data by calling getData on the form object. In this case, there is no given data to the form component, so the form component will instantiate a new DTO class and assign the values from the form to the DTO object. Now the test is green. How about your test? Is it green? Already? Great. Those functional tests in Symfony might be troubling for debugging sometimes. So if you have trouble getting them green, just have a look in the controller. In the browser. So if your tests are already green, you could easily merge to the next branch, right? Yeah, I guess there is a trait which displays all the output of the HTTP response. So that's not exception handling, but the output of the actual HTML exception. So, all right. So those additional challenges are absolutely not mandatory or required to continue. I will quickly solve them so you can at least see how it's done. The second challenge is about having some validation. So right now I have 4 tests failing because the functional test tries invalid data and expects us to fail instead of sending an email, which is quite simple to change by using some assertions, quite the default way. but that is also more a recap, I guess. Make sure not to add too many required characters to the fields, because testing will be annoying. Alright, that should do the trick. So we can easily add some annotations on our data model, and the form component, to be precise, it is the validation extension of the form component, will take care about creating form errors. All right, and the next thing that might be quite interesting to do for yourselves as well, because it is about the layout . So if we have a look at the browser right now, the form looks like this. And there is a feature in Symfony that is called form theme. Form themes are templates which are provided by Symfony to style the forms. And by default, you can look up in the Twig bridge which form themes there are. Wait a sec. And you can see there are some basic ones like div layout or table layout, and some themes that are supporting CSS frameworks. In our case, we're using Bootstrap 4, and we can use the Twig YAML file to define the form theme we are using. In this case, I'm going with Bootstrap 4 horizontal layout. And by adding this configuration flag, the rendering will be much better. All right, so do you have questions about those basic examples of form handling? No? Everything's fine? All right. So if you got stuck, there is yet a new branch on GitHub, which is contact solution. But besides the form layout, the Twig besides that, you don't really need the contact form anymore. All right, let's have a look at what's going on under the hood. All right, so I tried to build a picture how the form is working. So we have a controller, right? And the first line of the controller is create form. Abstract controller. We are using the form factory under the hood. So this is a service which is present in Symfony, feature called form registry. I think we might have an issue with the battery or something. and the form registry knows all the extensions. Provides text type, text area type, money type, currency type, all those text types, form types which is already installed as well, which has features like the entity type. This extension is responsible for that we can use our own form types in the controller, for example. Because every class, every form type we're implementing will get a tag so there is the auto wiring and the auto configuration feature, and every form type will get a tag that marks that form type for the dependency injection extension. So every time we require such a type, the I extension will give it, and there are a couple of other extensions. So the form factory is able to get the type we are requiring by using the registry, and after that, the form factory will instantiate a builder, a form builder. And I'm pretty sure you saw the form builder before, because that is given to us in the build form method of the form type. So we can use on the instance, we can use and work on the instance of the form builder to add fields and configure behavior, for example. After that, the form factory, that's what it looked like. Yeah. I think you saw that before. After that, the form is created. The form factory will create a get form on the builder, and the form instance is created and returned to the controller. The big difference is that the form type itself does not handle logic, or is not meant to handle logic of the form runtime. But the form instance is a runtime object that has a lot of logic in it. So, and then the next line, we have a handle request, right? So we give the request object to the form. We have a handle request method on the form object. And the form object knows a service like request handler. Actually, there are two implemented in the form component. One that deals with the super globals of PHP, like $post. And one that deals with the HTTP foundation. Thanks. With the HTTP foundation, which we are using in this case, right? We have a request object, and we give the request object to the form object. And the request handler is then extracting the data from the request. But this only works if the method is matching, so default in post, and the form is submitted, right? So the handle request will only change the state of the form if there is a payload to handle. But if there is a post request with a submitted form inside, the request handler will call the submit method on the form object. And this method will change the state of the object. So in the middle part of the controller, we do some state handling of the form object, like is it submitted, is it valid, and get data. But that doesn't really matter right now. And the last thing we're doing, we're creating a view object by calling create view, and this view object is then given to the form type once again, so we can manipulate the form view of the parent type. And if it's a compound type, you can always manipulate the view of child types using the finished view as well. So the difference between build view and finished view is that you have the views from child types in the finished view. All right, and this view is given to the controller back. All right. So a lot is going on, but the main thing to focus on is the form object. So let's talk about the extension points. We all know the form type, which has those method. So more than you might expect. Usually we just use the configure options and the build form. I just told you about build view and finish view. And there's always a get block prefix, which is more about the view layer, and we'll skip that, but the get parent one is important. Form types can inherit another form type, but we don't do it by extending them, extending the PHP class, but using the get parent method to tell the form component explicitly, I'm a child of the text type, for example. All right. So it describes structure of the form and has options. Form options is a kind of typed options array which is typed by using the options resolver, which is a small component. And we can give options using the create form as a third argument, and we will get the options in the build form as a second argument. And we can define default options or required options in the configure options. So on the resolver there is not only a set default, but a set required, for example, as well. And you can even define which types are valid for an option. All right. Inheritance is possible, and they are extensible. We will have a look at extensibility maybe later on. And the next thing is we can change behavior of the form submit in here. Well, we configure that we want to change the behavior. So that's the form type extension. Right now, we will skip that part, but we can use the form type extension. The interface looks quite similar to the form type. We have a build form, build view, and finish view, and configure options, so quite similar to the form type. But we have a get extended type. We can extend multiple types and change their form or view or options. And we can, for example, extend types that we even did not define ourselves. So if you want to change the structure, the view or the options of the text type, which is defined by the core extension of Symfony, you are able to do this using a form type extension. So form type extension is pretty useful if you want to manipulate existing form types, which you did not write yourself, or implement behavior or structure across multiple form types. All right. This is an example. We could, for example, add a no-validate attribute in our view of the form. So we could get rid of the front-end validation if we want to. And get extended type, in this case, I use the form type, which is the base type of all form types. So every form type that is implemented will then have the no-validate attribute. So if you're up for a little challenge, maybe on your way home to your home, right? You can have a look at this Symfony issue, which is looking for a feature that is quite similar to this implementation. You need an option as well to configure it, but I think, yeah, it's open for more than more than 6 years now, but it might be a very easy pick. If you have questions about contributing to Symfony, Christian or Nicolas are very good to talk to. All right. We saw that slide before, right? Well, and we see it again. Ah, yeah, configures behavior. That's the point. Let's have a look at configuring behavior using form types. So, the next level extension points. And let's go back to this. You remember that was our starting point. Having a HTML representation of a form and having an object. So, and you remember this one? Let's try to combine that in a way. So we create a form, we change it, and then we handle request, and we change the object, right? So that's the way the form component works. But create form and handle requests are the methods we are using in the controller. Under the hood, we are using set data on the form object to inject given data, and we're using the submit method to bind the request data to the form object. So that's the part that happens here, right? Well, I guess this also has low batteries. Well, that's the submit. All right. So let's talk about data mappers. The next extension point we're going to learn about is data mappers and which problem we try to solve with them. If we have a standard object, we're talking about the PHP object on the backend side, it looks something like this. Please don't mix up private and public properties. That's just an example that both is possible. But we have public properties or private with getters and setters. Quite easy. Symfony form component will get along with that. Just subject and sender and message. If we have something like that, a mismatch between the property name and the functions, the accessors, we can use the property path, which is an option. And we can just define, okay, send from is the method or the property path to use. But when we are going to something like this, sender, send from, and from, it's not possible to use a property path or default behavior anymore. And it gets worse when we have something like this, a constructor with mandatory arguments. So if we have different types of objects, PHP objects on server side, we need a better solution. And therefore we can use data mappers. And data mappers will be executed in set data and submit. So in the form object, data mappers are called. So we use an implementation and an interface which is called data mapper interface. And there are two methods. One is map data to forms, where you have the data object and the form object, and you have to get the data and give it to the forms. And the other way around, we have map forms to data, where we get the submitted form and we have to give the new data or inject the new data in the data object. So the purpose is to map data between model and form, and we register it in the form type. That's what I mean when I say we configure behavior in the form type, because we use the form type to tell the component, oh, we need a special data mapper in this case. And it's often combined with the empty data. So what's the empty data option? I told you before that the Symfony form component will instantiate an object if you don't give one. But if we have mandatory constructor arguments, for example, Symfony cannot simply call new on the DTO, right? Might fail, or will fail. And we're not using closure bind or reflection magic to tackle that, but we can use the empty data option for that. All right. For example, we can use a closure for the empty data, and we will get the form interface and can just create a new object and hand over the data from the form fields. Right? We have the form instance and get the fields and the data on it. And the second one is map data to forms. And you see we have to do some guard clauses for null, for example, or if the type is unexpected. And that's quite important that we then call iterator to array. Usually the form is an iterator, and we have to transform it to an array to use the fields in this case. And the next method is about mapping the form to data. And in this case, it's a value object, so we are not manipulating the existing object, but we're creating a new one. All right. So the basic concept of a data mapper is to control the flow of the data between the form and an object. So the second challenge, I need to push a branch for that. The second challenge, is about a category form. We are creating a product CRUD, and products have categories. And a category at first only has a name. So you need to pull or fetch, and then you can merge the category O1-base branch, and afterwards you need to execute bin console doctrine schema update --false to update the database, or in fact create it the first time, I guess. And if you go to the home page after that, you should see something like this. So I guess we can start with the challenge. And there are two things to do. At first, implement a category type. We already have a category controller now, and we have a template already. You wrote one in the contact challenge, so I guess we know about that. So you just have to write a category type, and you have to implement a data mapper interface as well. And you can see in the challenge markdown file that I wrote, we implement the data mapper interface in the form type. So if I go back, maybe we can see that. Yeah, so I'm using the form type to implement the data mapper as well. So you can just implement the data mapper. You could just use a different class as well, but I think it's easier now to have it in one class. And of course you need to tell the builder, the form builder up there, that you're using this class as data mapper as well. So in the markdown file there's also a link to the official documentation about that. And maybe a tricky part is that you need to catch the category exception, which is thrown in case of an invalid name. I guess an invalid name is a name shorter than 3 characters in this case, quite easy. And then we will edit form error by ourselves. So we saw before how the validation constraints add form errors. In this case, we do it ourselves because the exception is thrown by the object, and we need to catch that. Let me know if you have questions. In this case, the category has mandatory arguments, or at least one mandatory argument name in the constructor. So we need to define empty data, and we need to define a data mapper. And you define the empty data option in the configure options method. It should be possible to get the test screen without changing anything in the category entity or the category controller. So just by adding the category type. Right now we just need to define a single field, and that's called name. Parent and children are not part of the first part of the challenge. Maybe if you get the first challenge done quite fast, you can add parent as well. So while implementing the category type, we implement the build form method. That's always our starting point, I guess. And we add the field name on the builder, and we set the data mapper to this. And for the category type to be a valid data mapper, it needs to implement the data mapper interface. And there's also a link in the challenges to the documentation page, which also gives you examples for copy and pasting some default code that needs to be implemented by a data mapper. I think it's break time, coffee break, for 20 minutes. Afterwards, we will have a look at the solution, and we will do the solution together and at other extension points. This example of exception handling is from the empty data. So if you have the closure for the empty data option, you will have to do exception handling like that. So the first thing we did in the category type was to implement the build form method with adding the name field and configuring that the category type is also our data mapper. The next thing is to implement the data mapper interface. So our category type extends the abstract type and implements the data mapper interface. So the second method we need to implement is the configure options. Someone already has the configure options? We need two options, right? The first one is the data class. So we bind the category type to the category entity. And the second one is that we define the empty data. I'll show you. Well, that's a different object. That's a contact object, and we need the category object. But it looks something like this. right? And there is a to-do, we need error handling, and you saw error handling on the slide before. If I'm going too fast, let me know. Yeah, the category constructor might throw a category exception, and that's the one to catch. And when you catch, you can add a form error. And you can add a form error on the form or on a form field. So the difference is that there are global form errors which are displayed in our template above the form, or we can have form errors on our form fields. The option is empty data. Yeah, there is the autocomplete as well. I always recommend, if you're using PHP Storm, you should use the Symfony plugin as well. Because the Symfony plugin even provides you autocompletion for the form options. That's quite handy. The empty data option is used by the form component to instantiate or get the data if there's nothing in the nothing given before. So when you use a closure, the closure is executed and the return value of the closure is used as a data object then. While implementing the data mapper, we just have to take care about the name right now. So we have to get the name from the object and write to the field name, or get the form data from the field name and write into the category method rename. I guess that's the method, right? Map data to forms looks like this. You have a call iterated to array, and you can access the form fields using array access, and then call set data on it. In this case, it's quite easy, but sometimes it might be more complex. Don't get confused by this sign up here. It's a strict equal, so 3 equal signs, but some editors display it differently. I would fix those issues with static code analysis with variable text. But sure, you could iterate over the forms and pull out by name, but that's not very easy, I guess. That's the easy way. And I would usually try to make those tools happy with annotations. So that's easy on that part, I guess. So I'll start by merging category base, right? My test suite is failing again. Sorry. Ooh, more than I expected. Well, let's see. And I'll add a category type. I extend the abstract type and override the method build form. There's just one field right now, and as a second step, I set the data mapper to this. Like I said before, I am able to use a separate service for that as well. And I now need to implement the data mapper interface. All right. secondly, I need to implement the configure options method and add some options like data class, which is category in this case, and of course the empty data. I just tried to return a new category using the form get name, and I reference the form field here and use the data of it. And the form construct might throw an exception, and I will, in that case, I will add a new form error using the exception message. That is not actually a very good idea to use the exception message, because the form error will be displayed. But later on we might have the translation component as well, and then we can always translate that very easily. So there's something else. The construct expects the first argument to be a string. By default, if there's no data in a form field, the data is null. So we could now add a type in like this. So we do an explicit conversion of null to an empty string. Or a different solution. We could define empty data for this name field as well, and set empty data for this field to an empty string. So that's something to keep in mind, right? All form types have options. We configure the options for the category type in this very method down there, but we can configure the child types we're using as well. So, given we have existing data and we want to map it to a form, so the source of the data is the data object and the target is the form. Given we have no data, so we can easily return null. And for sure I need to check for the type as well. And if you have a look at the definition in the interface, that's something very typical for the form component. There's extensive documentation in the extension points. So you will see what is expected, what is given, and which exceptions can I throw. And those exceptions are caught and converted to form errors as well. So I can throw the exception unexpected type, for example. well, and I convert the iterator to an array, and then I can access the form field by using array access. And it might help to add something like this, or you could easily add it up here. Well, then you have autocompletion. And I will get name. Use this. Yes?
What do you return outside of the block?
Yeah, that's right. I can or should add a return null. I could move it down here, doesn't really matter.
Is there a reason why you don't share this or use set defaults and pass an error?
Ah,
Saying, will I add blah blah, will I add blah blah?
no, well, that's more a thing in my head, I guess. There is no reason why, and actually I use the chaining while adding fields, but not for the, that's just, never mind, that's my weirdo head. So there's no technical reason for that. Someone already has the second part? The map forms to data? Kinda? Is the test green? Almost. Yeah. Make sure my example slide up there was with an immutable value object. That means I instantiate the new object. But in this case, we need to edit an existing object. So the second method, map forms to data, in the view data parameter, there is an existing category object, and which is given by you by a reference, of course, as an object, and you can call the rename method on it. You don't have to create a new category. In fact, that might fail because you won't edit, but create a new one, as long as they are managed by doctrine, right? So the view data parameter is the pre-existing category object. So we could put it another way. If we don't have an object, so if we are creating a category, we end up here. If we have a pre-existing category and we want to create a view, we end up map data to forms, and if we're editing a category, we end up down there map forms to data. So to satisfy the test which is testing editing of the data, you need to rename the existing category instead of instantiating a new one. Someone already has green tests? Yes? Awesome. For later. Not for now, for later. There is a second challenge, and you will see it in the Markdown file, to add parents, so that categories have parents. I don't think we have the time for that right now because we need to go on to the next extension point. But if you want to continue on your flight back or something, and of course you can create pull requests later on if you want, and I will check them. I don't know. What? So I do check if the name changes at least. And if there is a change, I use the rename method. But make sure to do it in a try catch as well. So in recap, data mappers are quite good tool if I want to manage from where to where the data is flowing, to control how to set or get the data. So for debugging, it might be easier to go into the browser tab. So it should be localhost port 8000/contact. Actually, it does a create and rename, so an edit as well. Well, nevertheless, I will just push a solution So maybe you can commit your changes or stash them and switch to the rescue branch so we can go on to the next challenge. So if you got stuck, just commit your changes or stash them away and check out this branch. So you're good to continue. So we had a look at data mappers. Next extension point. Data mappers are for controlling how the data flows from form to data and the other way. Next thing we are looking at is data transformer. Data transformer sounds, at the first, it sounds quite similar, but it's more about this issue. Do you spot the difference? We don't have a scalar value for the email on the right hand side. It's a value object, right? So before it was just string representation on the HTML side and a string representation on the form side, object side. And this needs to change now, and therefore we have data transformers. Data transformer is a very simple interface. It's a transform and a reverse transform. So the transformation should be reverted by the reverse transform. Right? In the example, we have a email object. So the transform should create an email object by a string, and the reverse transform should create a string representation by email object. But actually, there are two ways of transformer, two kinds. The model transformer that has on the one hand side the model and creates a normalized view. And the reverse transform is from normalized data to model data. Normalized is usually just a string representation. And we have a second kind of transformer, so-called view transformer. They are used to take the view data and transform them to normalized data, and transform normalized data to view data. So the data in the view might differ from the normalized as well. But usually we just implement model transformers that take care about having a string representation.
Question. So the normalized data is the one that is submitted to the form.
Actually, the submit, the transformation is part of the submit.
Okay.
But if you, later on we will have a brief look at form events, and you can access the normalized data using an event. And that event is called submit. Maybe that's the point you mean. All right. And as well, this one is registered in the form type. So once again, we configure the behavior of the form submit and the form set data using the form type. Looks something like this. Once again, we reuse the form type as a data transformer. And as we saw, there are two kinds of transformers. The interface is just one, but we can add it as model transformer or view transformer. And in our case, we also just use a model transformer, and it looks something like this. So if it's a null value, we know it's just an empty string. And the extension point is designed to catch a transformation failed exception. And this exception is also turned into a form error. So for example, if we check for email, or in our case, it will be another value object, and it's not expected, not the same object as we expect, we can throw transformation value failed exception, Or in the other implementation, in the reverse transform, we can catch a domain exception, for example, and upcast it to a transformation failed exception. So, next challenge. Next challenge is about product form. And I quickly need to push that one. So, we created a category form, and now we are creating a product form. The product form is more advanced. So, that's the branch you need to merge. And this time there's also coming new stuff to your repository, like, I guess, a price type. So, the product entity is more complex than the category entity. The category entity has a name and parents and children, of course. But the price type is used for a price in the product object. And there is as well, of course, a name of a product, and the product has a category as well. And the important thing, we have a SKU, stock keeping unit, which is a quite typical identifier in an e-commerce stock project. And that's the first thing we need to do. We have two missing form types. The first one is an SKU type. And this is quite simple, but we have to implement a data transformer. If you have a look at the product entity, it's already there in your entity folder. The SKU is a subtype which is used by the product, right? So that's the value object. And we're creating a type explicitly for that subfield. So that's the first challenge. The second part is to implement the product type. That's a bit more of work, and we will need a data mapper once again. But I guess you can copy-paste some of the parts we just wrote. And repetition is a good way to practice things. All right. Challenge clear? Have a look at the product entity, how it is shaped, and which fields you may need. And then you can start off by shaping the structure of the form. I usually tend to think about the structure of the form at first, and then to think about the behavior. Once again, you will find documentation links in the Markdown file about the challenge. And there is a quite nice article about data transformers, and you just have to adapt that to the SKU value object. And for having a slimmer implementation of the SKU, you can extend the text type. The text type is already giving you a form field, and we need a form field as well. So you can use form type extension by using the getParent method in the form type. Yeah, the value of getParent would be the text type class, right? So if you start with the SKU type, you implement the build form method and tell the builder that this type is the data transformer for the model view. So, and secondly, you need to implement the data transformer interface. So let's have a look at the value object. It's just a simple string which has to match a certain regex pattern, and there is a toString. So we can just call the construct, catch for the exception, and on the other hand, we can just call toString on an existing one. So if I implement a form type for that. Oh, sorry. So you didn't saw that as well. So if you have a look at the SKU value object, quite simple one, just one condition. I override the build form method to configure the additional model transformer to be this type. And I implement the data transformer interface as well. And what I told you before, I even reuse the text type from the core extension, so I don't need to care about the structure of the form. I just reuse the defined structure of the text type and add additional behavior, which is the transform. So the transform method should transform the model to string representation, and the reverse transform should transform from string representation to value object. So if the value is null, I just return an empty string as a guard condition. That's most of the times in the form component extension points I have to write some kind of guard implementations. And secondly, I check if the value is the expected object. And that's already it. Looks good.
I think you need to check for null too, or temporary empty.
Might be. While using DDD, rich domain models, and more advanced domain classes while working with Symfony forms, data mappers and data transformers are quite useful, right? But of course, there are different approaches. You can also use quite stupid DTO objects and convert them to your domain models. That's possible as well. And it's always a good option. Maybe that should be a disclaimer to this workshop. I'm showing you the extension points, but they are just one option, right? You can always handle your data outside of Symfony forms. So, that's for the SKU identifier, but we still have some work to do, right? What do we have in price? We have in product. A product as well has a name. It has SKU and a category and a price, right? Something else? The name is a simple string, so we can use text type for that. What about this? We just created a new type for that. Any thoughts about that? Pardon? We have a category type, yeah, but we want to reference an existing category over here. We don't want to create a new one, so we're not reusing the category type, but we want to select from existing categories. Choice, but there's even a better one, entity type, right? So the doctrine extension provides a type for us that we could easily use to select a pre-existing entity. And therefore, for the price, you merged a type that is already existing, a price type. If you want to have a look how value objects, immutable value objects are handled, you can have a look at the price type. It's quite similar to the category type before. So, but the price as well has a constructor with mandatory arguments. So like at the category type before, we need to implement a data mapper. The entity type has some very important options like class, because we have to specify which entity should be used. In this case, category. And of course, once again, we have to define the data class, which is the product entity itself. So, and once again, we tell the form type that it is also the data mapper. And we implement the data mapper interface as well. Unfortunately, we're running a bit out of time, but I think this is already stuff we handled, so I will a bit rush through it. But of course, you can join while implementing. Let's have a look at the interface. Well, that's how the form should look like right now. You can spot that there is a subform rendered, right? So in a real daily project, you might need to break this up, right? In a more usable interface. So that's nothing new. We implement those guard clauses and transform the form iterator to an array. And you can always add those method tags, parameter tags, to improve the autocomplete from the IDE. And now we are working on existing data to fetch the data from the source and write it to the form. So it's quite straightforward in this case. We don't have to deal with a representation of the data because the subtype will take care about that. At least for the SQU right now. We haven't done anything for the category, right? And that's something I should change for a second. If I create a new category, for example food, and I go to the product page once again, I will get an exception because the form rendering does not know how to handle the entity, right? It could not be converted to string. So that's an additional option at the entity. I can define where the choice label is coming from, and I just give it a property path. In this case, it's just using the getName method, and then there is a select option. Well, this time I need to check if everything is alright with a form. So I need to get the SKU. No. So it's not an instance of SKU. I need to return. Because I only can use the object, the SKU, if it's an object, right? And if it's not an object, the data transformation in the SKU type is failing. And the failure of the data transformation will already add a form error, so I don't have to take care about that. The form has a field name. And the form has a field, what was the second one? SKU. So as before, as we used the empty data for the category, we just use it here once again. This time, the construct of the object will throw different types of exceptions. For example, we have a product exception, which is thrown if the name is invalid. So we catch that one and can add an exception, an error explicitly to that field. Yeah, and I guess that's it for now. There is also a price exception, but that's already handled by the price type. So the last method is map forms to data, and we should make sure that we are dealing with existing data. And as well, we can use this. And once again, it's iterator to array. You might check, of course, if the data is changed like we did it in the category, but the important part is that we use those custom methods to set the data to the existing object. And the SKU cannot be changed, so I don't need to override that one. That's a business constraint in this case. You can't change the identifier. In this case, I can catch, once again, the product exception and do an upcasting, and add a form error for the name in this case. As you can see, you have to get used to the structure of those methods, right? You have to check for null values, you have to check for empty values, you have to check if the data you're getting is what you're expecting, and you need to get used which exceptions are available for you. And to be honest, I think this form iterator stuff as well is a bit tricky, and you have to get used to it. And of course, debugging helps a lot if you're implementing a form type for your own and have to remember which method is called when. But that's something I want to show you as well. Oh, that looks good. Awesome. I will push afterwards. Well, let's have a look at the slides. Yeah, we did that. All right. The last thing we'll have a look at is form events. I am pretty sure you know about the event dispatcher in Symfony. The event dispatcher is a component which is quite famous, and you are able to hook into the workflow of the kernel, for example. And there are form events as well, and we can register listeners and subscribers in the form type as well. So which form events are there? If we have a look at the setData method, which is writing existing data to the form, right? Which is then used in the field, form fields in the view. We have the transformers, we saw them. They convert model data to view data. And afterwards, there is even the data mapper that maps data to form. If we want to hook into this and maybe manipulate the structure of the form or manipulate the data, there are events to do that. There is a preset data event, and we can manipulate the structure of the form, for example, if we want to remove something, for example, or maybe add another field. And there is a post set data, which is dispatched after the data is mapped into the view. And on the other hand, we have the submit, where the submitted data is written to the given object, and we have a data mapper that maps the data from form to the object. And after that, we have as well the data transformers once again, and we have a pre-submit event and a post-submit, and there's just enough space to have a submit event as well. So if you want to work with the normalized data, you can hook into the submit event. I cannot really tell why there is no event on the other side between the view transformers and the model transformers, but I think there is not really a use case for that. Okay. Form events are to interact with form or data dynamically, and the set data, so which is handling existing data from PHP side, has two events, preset data and post-set data. The form submit, which handles the submitted data and maps it to the existing data structure, has three events. And we register them once again in the form type. And it looks something like this. So for instance, we could add a new method in our form type. In this case, it's on preset data. And we bind the preset data event using that add event listener method and this callable. But we could of course add a subscriber as well. So I will quickly show you how that could work. If we have a look at this form, you see we have all of the input fields. And I told you before, there is a business constraint that I'm not allowed to change this SKU because it's an identifier which is maybe used by the logistics or something. So I could just add an additional event listener and use form events pre-submit and a callable, which is this to remove the SKU field if it's already set. So I'll get a form event object, and from there I can get the I can get the form. And I can get the form. So if this is already an instance of SKU, I can remove SKU. Hopefully that works out. That's no. Why not? You know, you can always dump. Maybe. Why I'm not getting the. Oh, it's the wrong event. Sorry. Well, then I have to check later on while writing that this still is set, of course. Because I cannot write to a non-existing form field. So that's the way to modify the form by using an event listener. Okay. Those are the extension points I wanted to show you. There are even more extension points, of course, if you care about type guessing, which is a feature of detecting which type should be used as a form type. And then there is the form extension itself. And I told you about the validation extension and the dependency injection extension. And there's a rendering extension and so on. Quick recap. The form type is always the starting point to configure form and the form view. The form type extension is an extension point to extend given, predefined, or multiple form types. The transformer transforms data representations from model to view. And the mapper controls where the data is coming and going from. Right? And we can use form events to manipulate form and data dynamically. So that's it from me for now. If you have any questions, I'll be around. And make sure to use the voting link you got in the mail this morning. Thanks.